What is to be done? What triggers this terror is the awareness of how we are in the midst of a radical change. Although individual acts can, in a direct short circuit of levels, affect the higher level social constellation, the way they affect it is unpredictable. The constellation is properly frustrating. Although we, individual or collective agents, know that it all depends on us, we cannot ever predict the consequences of our acts. We are not impotent, but quite the contrary, omnipotent, without being able to determine the scope of our powers. The gap between causes and effects is irreducible, and there is no big other to guarantee the harmony between the levels, to guarantee that the overall outcome of our interactions will be satisfactory. The deadlock is here deeper than it may appear, as has been repeatedly developed by Dupuy. The problem is that the big other continues to function in the guise of second nature, of the minimally reified social system which is perceived as in itself. Each individual perceives the market as an objective system confronting her, although there is no objective market, just the interaction of the multitude of individuals. So that, although each individual knows this very well, the specter of the objective market is this same individual's fact of experience, determining her beliefs and acts. Not only the market, but our entire social life is determined by such reified mechanisms. Scientists and technologists who keep scientific technological progress alive with their incessant activity nonetheless experience this progress as an objective constraint that determines and runs their lives. This constraint is perceived as systemic. No one is personally responsible for it. Everyone just feels the need to adapt themselves to it. And the same goes for capitalism as such. No one is responsible. All are caught in the objectified urge to compete and profit, to keep the circulation of capital flowing. Prosopopeia is usually perceived as a mystification to which naive consciousness is prone, that is, as something to be demystified. At the beginning of Monteverde's Orfeo, the goddess of music introduces herself with the words, Io sono la musica. Is this not something which soon afterwards, when psychological subjects had invaded the stage, became unthinkable, or rather unrepresentable? It is therefore all the more surprising to see objective social scientists practicing the primitive art of prosopopeia. Dupuy underlines how sociologists interpret electoral results. Say, when the government retains its majority, but only barely so, the result is read as the voters prolong their trust into the government, but with a warning that it should do its work better, as if the electoral result was the outcome of the decision of a single meta-subject, the voters, who wanted to deliver a message to those in power. And although Hegel is often dismissed as the very model of idealist prosopopeia, the spirit talks through us, finite mortals, or in the inversion of the materialist critique of Hegel, we, mortal humans, transpose the results of our activity into autonomous spirit. Hegel's notion of objective spirit precisely undermines such prosopopean mystification. Objective spirit is not a meta-subject who runs history. It is crucial not to confuse Hegel's objective spirit with the Dilthian notion of a life form, a concrete historical world, as the objectified spirit, the product of a people, its collective genius. The moment we do this, we miss the point of Hegel's objective spirit, which is precisely that it is spirit in its objective form, experienced by individuals as an external imposition, a constraint even. There is no collective or spiritual supersubject that would be the author of objective spirit, whose objectivization this spirit would be. There is, for Hegel, no collective subject, no subject spirit beyond and above individual humans. Therein resides the paradox of objective spirit. It is independent of individuals, encountered by them as given, pre-existing them, as the presupposition of their activity, yet it is nonetheless spirit. That is, something that exists only insofar as individuals relate their activity to it, only as their. presupposition. So what is the problem today? The problem is that although our sometimes even individual acts can have catastrophic, ecological, and so forth consequences, we continue to perceive such consequences as anonymous, systemic, as something for which we are not responsible, for which there is no clear agent. More precisely, and here we are back to the logic of the madman who knows that he is not a grain of corn, but is worried that the chickens have not realized this fact. We know we are responsible, but the chicken, the big other, has not caught on. Or, insofar as knowledge is the function of the I, and belief the function of the other, we know the real state of affairs very well, but we do not believe it. The big other prevents us from believing it, from assuming this knowledge and responsibility. Contrary to what the promoters of the principle of precaution think, the cause of our non-action is not scientific uncertainty. We know it, but we cannot make ourselves believe in what we know. Take global warming, as already noted. With all the data regarding its nature, the problem is not the uncertainty about facts, as those who caution us against panic claim, but our inability to believe that it can really happen. Look through the window, the green grass and blue sky are still there. Life carries on. Nature follows its rhythm. And therein resides the horror of the Chernobyl accident. When one visits the site, with the exception of the sarcophagus, things look exactly the same as before. Life seems to have deserted the site, leaving everything the way it was. And nonetheless, we are aware that something is terribly wrong. The change is not at the level of the visible reality itself. It is more fundamental. It affects the very texture of reality. No wonder that there are some lone farmers around the Chernobyl site who continue to lead their lives as before. They simply ignore all the incomprehensible talk about radiation. This situation confronts us with the deadlock of the contemporary choice society in its most radical form. In the standard situation of the forced choice, I am free to choose on condition that I make the right choice, so that the only thing left for me to do is the empty gesture of pretending to accomplish freely what is, in any case, imposed on me. Here, on the contrary, the choice really is free, and is, for this very reason, experienced as even more frustrating. We find ourselves constantly in the position of having to decide about matters that will fundamentally affect our lives, but without a proper foundation in knowledge. We have been thrown into a time in which everything is provisional. New technologies alter our lives daily. The traditions of the past cannot be retrieved. At the same time, we have little idea of what the future will bring. We are forced to live as if we were free. It is thus not enough to vary the standard motif of the Marxist critique. Although we allegedly live in a society of choices, the choices effectively left to us are trivial, and their proliferation masks the absence of true choices, choices that would affect the basic features of our lives. While this is true, the problem is rather that we are forced to choose without having at our disposal the knowledge that would permit an informed choice. Here, perhaps, Dupuy is too quick when he attributes our disbelief in catastrophe to the impregnation of our minds by scientific ideology, which leads us to dismiss the sane concerns of our common sense, namely the gut sense which tells us that something is fundamentally amiss with the scientific attitude. The problem, as we have underlined, is much deeper. It resides in the unreliability of our common sense itself, which, habituated as it is to our ordinary life world, balks at accepting that the flow of everyday reality can be upset. The problem is thus that we can rely neither on the scientific mind nor on our common sense. They both reciprocally strengthen the myopia of the other. The scientific mind advocates a cold, objective appraisal of dangers and risks involved where no such appraisal is actually possible, while common sense cannot accept that a catastrophe can really occur. Dupuy refers to the theory of complex systems, which accounts for the two opposite features of such systems, their robust and stable character and their extreme vulnerability. These systems can accommodate themselves to great disturbances, integrate them, and find a new balance and stability, up to a certain threshold, a tipping point, beyond which a small disturbance can cause a total disaster and lead to the establishment of a totally different order. For many centuries, humanity did not have to worry about the impact on the environment of its productive activity. Nature was able to accommodate itself to deforestation, to the use of coal and oil, and so on. However, one cannot be sure whether today we are not approaching a tipping point. One really cannot be sure, since the point at which certainty would be possible is when it is already too late. We touch here the paradoxical nerve of morality christened moral luck by Bernard Williams. Williams evokes the case of a painter ironically named Gauguin, who left his wife and children and moved to Tahiti in order to fully develop his artistic genius. Was he morally justified in doing this or not? Williams answers that we can only answer this question in retrospect, after we learn the final outcome of his risky decision. Did he develop into artistic genius or not? As Dupuy has pointed out, we encounter the same dilemma apropos the urgency of doing something about the contemporary threat of various ecological catastrophes. Either we take this threat seriously and decide today to do things which, if the catastrophe does not occur, will appear ridiculous, or we do nothing and lose everything in the case of a catastrophe. The worst choice being that of a middle position, taking a limited number of measures, in which case we fail whatever should happen. That is to say, there is no middle ground when it comes to an ecological catastrophe. Either it will occur or it won't. In such a situation, the talk about anticipation, precaution, and risk control tends to become meaningless, since we are dealing with what, in the terms of Rumsfeldian epistemology, one should call the unknown unknowns. We not only do not know where the tipping point is, we do not even know exactly what we do not know. The most unsettling aspect of the ecological crisis concerns the so-called knowledge in the real, which can run amok. When the winter is too warm, plants and animals misread the hot weather in February as the signal that spring has already begun and start to behave accordingly, thus not only rendering themselves vulnerable to late onslaughts of cold weather, but also perturbing the entire rhythm of natural reproduction. In May 2007, it was reported that a mysterious disease, which is wiping out America's bees, could have a devastating effect on the country's food supply. About 1/3 of the human diet comes from insect-pollinated plants, and the bee is responsible for 80% of that pollination. Even cattle, which feed on alfalfa, depend on bees. While not all scientists foresee a food crisis, noting that large-scale bee deaths have happened before, this one seems particularly baffling and alarming. This is how one should imagine a possible catastrophe, a small-level interruption with devastating global consequences. One can learn even more from Rumsfeldian epistemology. The expression, of course, refers to the well-known incident in March 2003 when Donald Rumsfeld engaged in a little amateur philosophizing about the relationship between the known and the unknown. There are known knowns. These are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we don't know we don't know. What he forgot to add was the crucial fourth term, unknown knowns, things we do not know that we know, which is precisely the Freudian unconscious, the knowledge which does not know itself, as Lacan used to say. If Rumsfeld thought that the main dangers in the confrontation with Iraq were the unknown unknowns, the threats from Saddam, the nature of which he did not even suspect, what we should reply is that the main dangers are, on the contrary, the unknown knowns, the disavowed beliefs and suppositions we are not even aware of adhering to ourselves. In the case of ecology, these disavowed beliefs and suppositions are the ones which prevent us from really believing in the possibility of a disaster, and they combine with the unknown unknowns. The situation is like that of the blind spot in our visual field. We do not see the gap. The picture appears continuous. Our blindness to the results of systemic evil is perhaps more clearly perceptible apropos debates about communist crimes. There, responsibility is easy to allocate. We are dealing with subjective evil, with agents who committed them, and we can even identify the ideological sources: totalitarian ideology, the Communist Manifesto, Rousseau. When one draws attention to the millions who died as the result of capitalist globalization, from the tragedy of Mexico in the 16th century through the Belgian Congo Holocaust a century ago, Responsibility is denied. This just happened as the result of an objective process. Nobody planned and executed it. There was no capitalist manifesto. Ayn Rand came closest to writing it. And therein also resides the limitation of the ethical committees which pop up everywhere to counteract the dangers of unbridled scientific technological development. With all their good intentions, ethical considerations, and so forth, they ignore the more basic systemic violence. The fact that the Belgian King Leopold, who presided over the Congolese genocide, was a great humanitarian, proclaimed a saint by the Pope, cannot be dismissed as a mere case of ideological hypocrisy and cynicism. One can argue that, subjectively, he probably really was a sincere humanitarian, even modestly counteracting the catastrophic consequences of the vast economic project of ruthless exploitation of the natural resources of Congo over which he presided. Congo was his personal fiefdom. The ultimate irony is that most of the profits from this endeavor were directed for the benefit of the Belgian people, for public works, museums, and so on. In the early 17th century, after the establishment of the Shogun regime, Japan made a unique collective decision to isolate itself from foreign culture and to pursue its own path of a contained life of balanced reproduction focused on cultural refinement, avoiding any tendencies towards wild expansion. Was the ensuing period, which lasted till the middle of the 19th century, really just an isolationist dream from which Japan was cruelly awakened by Commodore Perry on the American warship? What if the dream is that we go on indefinitely in our expansionism? What if we all need to repeat, mutatis mutandis, the Japanese decision, and collectively decide to intervene in our pseudo-natural development, to change its direction? The tragedy is that the very idea of such a collective decision is discredited today. Apropos the disintegration of state socialism 2 decades ago, one should not forget that, at approximately the same time, the ideology of the Western social democratic welfare state was also dealt a crucial blow. It also ceased to function as the imaginary, able to arouse a collective, passionate commitment. The notion that the time of the welfare state is past is today a piece of commonly accepted wisdom. What these two defeated ideologies shared is the notion that humanity as a collective subject has the capacity to somehow limit impersonal and anonymous socio-historical development, to steer it in a desired direction. Today, such a notion is quickly dismissed as ideological and/or totalitarian. The social process is once again perceived as dominated by an anonymous fate beyond social control. The rise of global capitalism is presented to us as such a fate, against which one cannot fight. One either adapts oneself to it, or one falls out of step with history and is crushed. The only thing one can do is to make global capitalism as human as possible, to fight for global capitalism with a human face. This is what, ultimately, the third way is, or rather was about. The sound barrier will have to be broken here. The risk will have to be taken to endorse once more large collective decisions. If we are effectively to reconceptualize the notion of revolution in the Benjaminian sense of stopping the train of history which runs towards a catastrophe, it is not enough just to submit the standard notion of historical progress to critical analysis. One should also focus on the limitation of the ordinary historical notion of time. At each moment of time, there are multiple possibilities waiting to be realized. Once one of them actualizes itself, others are cancelled. The supreme case of such an agent of historical time is the Leibnizian God who created the best possible of worlds. Before creation, he had in his mind the entire panoply of possible worlds, and his decision consisted in choosing the best one among these options. Here, the possibility precedes choice. The choice is a choice among possibilities. What is unthinkable within this horizon of linear historical evolution is the notion of a choice act which retroactively opens up its own possibility. The idea that the emergence of something radically new retroactively changes the past, of course not the actual past, we are not in science fiction, but the past possibilities, or to put it in more formal terms, the value of the modal propositions about the past. Dupuy's point is that if we are to confront properly the threat of a cosmic or environmental disaster, we need to break out of this historical notion of temporality, we have to introduce a new notion of time. Dupuy calls this time the time of a project, of a closed circuit between the past and the future. The future is causally produced by our acts in the past, while the way we act is determined by our anticipation of the future and our reaction to this anticipation. This, then, is how Dupuy proposes to confront the forthcoming catastrophe. We should first perceive it as our fate, as unavoidable, and then, projecting ourselves into it, adopting its standpoint, we should retroactively insert into its past, the past of the future, counterfactual possibilities. If we had done this and that, the catastrophe we are in now would not have occurred, upon which we then act today. Therein resides Dupuy's paradoxical formula. We have to accept that, at the level of possibilities, our future is doomed, that the catastrophe will take place. It is our destiny. And then, against the background of this acceptance, we should mobilize ourselves to perform the act which will change destiny itself, and thereby insert a new possibility into the past. For Badiou, the time of the fidelity to an event is the futur antérieur. Overtaking oneself towards the future, one acts now as if the future one wants to bring about is already here. The same circular strategy of the futur antérieur is also the only truly effective one in the face of a calamity, say of an ecological disaster. Instead of saying, the future is still open, we still have the time to act and prevent the worst, one should accept the catastrophe as inevitable, and then act to retroactively undo what is already written in the stars as our destiny. And is not a supreme case of the reversal of positive into negative destiny the shift from classical historical materialism into the attitude of Adorno's and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment? While traditional Marxism enjoined us to engage and act in order to bring about the necessity of communism, Adorno and Horkheimer projected themselves into the final catastrophic outcome perceived as fixed, the advent of the administered society of total manipulation and the end of subjectivity, in order to stimulate us to act against this outcome in our present. And, ironically, does the same not hold for the very defeat of communism in 1990? It is easy, from today's perspective, to mock the pessimists, from the right to the left, from Solzhenitsyn to Castoriadis, who deplored the blindness and compromises of the democratic West, its lack of ethico-political strength and courage in dealing with the communist threat, and who predicted that the Cold War had already been lost by the West, that the communist bloc had already won, that the collapse of the West was imminent. But it is precisely their attitude which was the most effective in bringing about the collapse of communism. In Dupuy's terms, their very pessimistic prediction at the level of possibilities, of linear historical evolution, mobilized them to counteract it. We should thus ruthlessly abandon the prejudice that the linear time of evolution is on our side, that history is working for us, in the guise of the famous mole digging under the earth, doing the work of the cunning of reason. But how, then, are we to counter the threat of ecological catastrophe? It is here that we should return to the 4 moments of what Badiou calls the eternal idea of revolutionary egalitarian justice. What is demanded is 1. Strict egalitarian justice. All people should pay the same price in eventual renunciations. Namely, one should impose the same worldwide norms of per capita energy consumption, carbon dioxide emissions, and so on. The developed nations should not be allowed to poison the environment at the present rate, blaming the developing third world countries, from Brazil to China, for ruining our shared environment with their rapid development. 2. Terror. Ruthless punishment of all who violate the imposed protective measures, inclusive of severe limitations on liberal freedoms, technological control of prospective lawbreakers. 3. Voluntarism. The only way to confront the threat of ecological catastrophe is by means of large-scale collective decisions which run counter to the spontaneous, imminent logic of capitalist development. 4. And last but not least, all this combined with trust in the people, the wager that a large majority of the people supports these severe measures, sees them as its own, and is ready to participate in their enforcement. One should not be afraid to assert, as a combination of terror and trust in the people, the reactivation of one of the figures of all egalitarian revolutionary terrors, the informer who denounces the culprits to the authorities. In the case of the Enron scandal, Time magazine rightly celebrated the insiders who tipped off the financial authorities as true public heroes. Does, then, the ecological challenge not offer a unique chance to reinvent the eternal idea of egalitarian terror?